Welcome back to our discussion about the Seven Perspectives Theory by C. George Bourret. This is the second video in the series, and in this video we're going to be discussing the second perspective, which is known as the Authoritarian perspective. There is one video before this one that has an overview of the Seven Perspectives Theory and also then gets into discussion of the first perspective, which is the autistic perspective. So if you have not watched that video, I suggest that you do before watching this one so that you can better understand the material being discussed. So in this video, to describe what the authoritarian perspective is, we'll just get right into what C. George Bourret has written here on his website. He says, "The authoritarian view is a common one, perhaps the most common one. Although the authoritarian view is still a subjective view, it is a step above the autistic perspective. This is because it takes into account the view of others. In fact, it may be said to absorb the views of others. Developmentally, the simple fact of living among other human beings leads one out of the autistic and into the authoritarian perspective. A child must inevitably broaden his or her perspective in order to encompass that of significant others, even if only to survive. And in most circumstances, this process is enormously simplified by the fact that all of the child's immediate contacts share a single social reality. This is the perspective that most fully accepts social reality. This means, however, that an authoritarian person accepts only one social reality and understands it to be universal. Someone who does not accept this same social reality is seen as either infantile or insane. When the social reality is threatened, either by another social reality or by more immediate experiences, the tendency is for an authoritative person to respond with either defense or there is an opportunity for further epistemological development. Most children, as well as adults of primitive, isolated, and highly structured societies, will take this position. There is a tendency to legalistic thinking and an inordinate respect for tradition, even when painful. Furthermore, authoritarians tend to classify events, objects, and even people in more pigeonhole types of categories, with relatively few gradations. They also tend to believe in universal dualities, black versus white, good versus bad, us versus them, with little room for in between or both. Both the autistic and authoritarian views are subjective views in the sense that they believe in and value the interpretation of an experience, whether that experience be individual or social. In the autistic view, for example, the value of events relative to individual needs and desires is more important than truth, as some of the higher perspectives would understand it. In the authoritarian view, this weight of valuing has simply shifted to the social surround. But in either case, at least when we consider people beyond this infancy stage, there is in addition a particular faith in the power of words, which is in keeping with their attachment to a particular constructed reality. So to paraphrase, he's basically saying that the first two perspectives of the 7 perspectives, which are the autistic and the authoritarian, are in a category that he refers to as the subjective views, in that they take the interpretation of the experienced reality for granted. They assume that it represents all of reality. The only difference would be that the autistic perspective is one individual assuming that their personal reality represents all, whereas the authoritarian perspective, they expand it to a shared social reality. So it is still basically one interpretation of reality that is shared by multiple people. So it is at least expanded in that way, but it still only recognizes that one interpretation as being the absolute representative of all of reality. So in this section about morality, he says to review that each of the 7 perspectives has a view of value, which flows very clearly from that perspective's overall description. So for the authoritarian view, the value of good is founded in tradition and in the authoritarian promotion of that tradition. As Sorokin would put it, this is a morality of absolute principles, usually viewed as being handed down to humanity by God. So to paraphrase, Bourret explains that it is typically founded in ideas of tradition and authoritative promotion of that tradition, which is rather having your values formed in a very dogmatic way. That as long as the group says that this is how it is, then that is in fact how it is. If the group says that this is a good thing, then that makes it a good thing. If the group says that it is a bad thing, then that in fact makes it a bad thing. So whatever the group this is what makes the truth. That would be the absolute truth of something being valued as good, or the absolute truth of something being valued as bad. So the view then becomes sacrosanct. It becomes gospel. And while groups of people operating under this perspective, the authoritarian perspective, aren't necessarily inherently dysfunctional or anything, this is a perspective that does lend itself to a great potential for cult-like dynamics to develop. And of course, when a person with the authoritarian perspective encounters other people or groups of people who have a different account of reality or a different interpretation, they can go one of two ways. They can either respond in a very defensive way, because obviously the mere existence of other social realities challenges the truth, the absolute truth that particular authoritarian subscribes to. So under that feeling that it's an all or nothing type thing, like either my social reality is completely true and everyone else is wrong, or my social reality is wrong, like as an incorrect. So there's a tendency towards that black and white thinking again, all or nothing. Either we are completely right or we're not right at all, which understandably would put such a person who holds this authoritarian perspective in a very defensive position, in a very threatened position. So as Bourret explained, there's two different directions that this individual can go from that point on. They can either maintain this very defensive position that their social reality is in fact the absolute reality and any other social realities are wrong or evil or misinformed and must be silenced, must be denied their ability to express their interpretation. Or the other direction that a person in this position can then go is to develop their perspective further epistemologically, which would then put them in to the rationalistic perspective typically, which we will talk about that in the next video. So C. George Bourret has a section here entitled Mental Illness, in which he discusses various ways in which people or any individual can become sort of stuck in a particular perspective, unable to move up in their development of this hierarchy that he has plotted out here. So in this section he writes, "There are innumerable circumstances which lead to a halt or even a reversal in the movement towards elaboration. In the developmental sense, these are a matter of being faced by situations that are too complex to be dealt with, either in terms of differentiation or integration. On a more immediate level, these are situations where knowledge just cannot keep up with reality, where anticipation fails, yet adaptation is not immediately possible. So emotionally, what we're talking about are episodes of fear that are not resolved and therefore lead to continued anxiety and the defensive maneuvers that may accompany it, as well as long-term sadness and anger, which can manifest as depression or hostility. These situations may be a matter of a single traumatic event or a long-term problem, which I would note would be described as cases of complex PTSD. That could even be rather insignificant if it were not for their continued repetition. There are certainly physical problems that could have these results, such as the trauma of natural disasters or the long-term effects of chronic illness or abuse. Most physical events, however, have been well covered by the evolution of genetically based physiological mechanisms, and so are fairly dealt with in less extreme ways. On the other hand, traumas and continual incongruencies within the social reality are more often than not insufficiently addressed by physiological mechanisms, even to the point of damaging those mechanisms. Because constructed reality is in fact constructed, it is much more likely to contain within it conflicts that immediate experience, as well as internal inconsistencies, such as the famous catch-22, or damned if you do, damned if you don't. Traumas, be they social or physical, are a fairly simple matter, in that the sense that these symptoms, phobias, and compulsive behaviors and whatnot, can usually be directly tied to the traumatic event. Although this does not mean that they are easily taken care of. I believe that many more of our problems derive from the day-to-day difficulties of dealing with a reality, especially a social reality, that is beyond our capacity, that is just a little too complex for us, that is just a little bit too chaotic. In fact, I think the term chaotic environment may cover the great majority of causes for human unhappiness in modern society, and especially in the less precisely defined disorders. So when he talks about disorders, particularly of the authoritarian perspective, or disorders that lead to sort of a fixation on the authoritarian type of perspective, he writes, The neurotic authoritarian is a person who retreats from the complexity of life into the authoritarian structures of a social reality. Again, the neurotic is not a child, nor a peasant in some traditional society. So this authoritarian worldview must be supported by defensive mechanisms that help him or her to avoid full recognition of traumas and chaos. The authoritarian neurotic will tend to exhibit his or her rigid sociality in one of two ways. Depending on such factors as temperament, upbringing, and specific social situation, they will be either aggressive or compliant. Aggressive neurotics, predominantly men, due to temperament and upbringing, tend to expect others to bend to their will, and are likely to be angry and even violent if their expectations are not met. Compliant neurotics, however, which are predominantly women due to both temperament and upbringing, tend to expect to yield to the will of others. They suffer from sadness and spend much of their cognitive time trying to adapt, trying to accept into themselves changes that would be more efficiently accomplished by changing others, most often the aggressive male that they keep company with. So in regards to what Bourret is saying about mental illnesses or the sources of traumatic experiences that might lead to someone basically getting locked in to a particular perspective along this line of development, can result in the most basic way from situations in which the developmental level of that individual was not advanced enough to cope with the complexity of a particular problem that was being presented at that time. So when they were probably too young to understand why a particular problem was taking place or why a particular punishment happened, they were developmentally not capable of understanding what was going on. And so what sort of ends up happening is they compensate by being locked into that particular view. When he mentions that social reality is constructed and much more likely to contain within it conflicts with immediate experiences, this is unsurprising in regards to the authoritarian perspective, because even within a group of people that perhaps all agree on one particular reality, the fact of the matter is that they are all still different people. They are going to walk around their lives experiencing different things. They are different ages, different sexes, even have different cultural backgrounds, and have experienced different things for all of those reasons. So what is basically inevitable is that if everyone in that group is encouraged to only subscribe to one version of reality, and they all in fact are still experiencing very different versions of reality, then what is going to happen is an internal conflict where, even on an individual level, a person will experience something that is incongruent with what the social reality states as true. So it basically sets up people to be constantly invalidated, even gaslighted, by their own life experiences, by their own social narrative that has been built up as the truth. So when they experience things that don't fall in line with that, quote, truth that has been established by that social narrative, then that becomes a source of trauma, basically, because they are not able to accept a certain aspect of their own lived experiences. And this can be a great source of suffering, a great source of pain. It can, for some individuals, present that opportunity for expansion into a new level of perspective, which that would be sort of the silver lining of such a circumstance. But unfortunately, it also can not go that way. It can go the way of reinforcing their belief in this absolute social truth and to deny their own lived experiences. That would be very unfortunate, but that is definitely one path that is taken. And of course, Bourret explains that in order to help a person who has subscribed to the authoritarian perspective to a neurotic degree, he explains that in order to help this person, you, well, have to appeal to authority. They're stuck in the authoritarian perspective, so in order to sort of get through to them, you have to sort of, well, speak their language, speak to them through that perspective in order to show them the problems with that very perspective. It's kind of ironic but unironic. It's ironic but appropriate. I don't know. It's I think a lot of people are inclined to speak to others when we are trying to get them to realize something, or maybe change their view on something. We more often than not are inclined to speak from our own perspective, right? To explain our own reasoning, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it does run into issues if we're speaking to someone who is essentially in a more simplistic developmental perspective. Then speaking to them from the complexity of your own perspective is probably going to be lost on them. It's going to, in other words, just go over their head. So you have to, as they say, come down to their level is one way to think about it, but you can just think of it in terms of that you're trying to speak to them through their own perspective style. You're speaking to them in a language that they understand. Okay, so that's gonna do it for our discussion on the authoritarian perspective. As I said in the next video, we're going to discuss the rationalistic perspective. So keep an eye out for that. We'll see you next time.